Before I begin, allow me to express my gratitude to the faculty of Yale Divinity School, and I'm particularly honored to realize that I'm a part of this celebration of women at this wonderful institution. So thank you for the invitation. As members of the Yale Divinity School, you stand in a great tradition, and your work is tremendously important. I salute your endeavors. May you go from strength to strength. I speak to the faculty and to the students. Lest you think I'm merely voicing introductory pleasantries, I want to share with you a visual datum recently sent to me by one John Gager, my dissertation advisor at Princeton University, the author of many books, including Reinventing Paul and an MDiv from Yale, 1962. Here it is. I think here it is. Cue to the picture. This billboard belongs to a Presbyterian church in rural upstate Maine. Its pastor is the Reverend Diane Hope Hugo, Yale Divinity School, 1992. John, driving by this sign, could not believe it. He sent the photo to me. I could not believe it. This tiny community in the outback of New England, I speak as a Rhode Islander, is now, thanks to its Yale-trained pastor, out in front of approximately 95% of the Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas. I repeat what I have just said. The work that you all do here, this is serious, is very important, and it matters very much. Thank you for letting me be part of it for the next 3 evenings. Let's bracket the thought communicated by Reverend Hugo's billboard for the moment, though we will return to it. Thank you. Please direct your attention. Does everyone have a handout? This will be on the test. Okay. Please direct your attention to the handout where you will see the quotation starting in number 1 from Albert Schweitzer's classic essay, The Mysticism of the Apostle Paul. It's an important idea, and I'll read it. The fact that even the second Christian generation does not know what to make of Paul's teaching suggests the conjecture that he built his system upon a conviction which ruled only in the first generation. But what was it that disappeared out of the first Christian generation? What but the expectation of the immediate dawn of the messianic kingdom of Jesus? Schweitzer's great contribution to New Testament scholarship was his courageous insight that the movement's first generation believed fervently that it was history's last generation. Apocalyptic eschatology, temporally defined. God's kingdom was at hand, nearer to us now, says Paul, item 2 on your handout, than when we first became convinced. For the next 3 evenings, working our way through our ancient evidence, we're going to reimagine what propelled this odd Jewish movement out of Jerusalem into the wider world of the Roman Empire, where it picked Paul up along the way. In so doing, we will steer by Schweitzer as our North Star. Apocalyptic eschatology temporally defined. God's kingdom in Paul's lifetime was at hand. In our third lecture, we'll look in greater detail at what that meant. A second point of orientation. We are looking at theological ideas, but we are examining them historically. Historians are at the mercy of the accidental survival of data. Theory, commitments to certain lines of interpretation, transform data into evidence. We grab onto as much as we can, inscriptions, amulets, art, archaeological sites, contemporary literature. We build a thick description of the social universe of our ancient subjects, which sets the interpretive context. We do the best we can, but we begin our efforts knowing in advance that we can never know everything that we want to know and everything we need to know. Thus, the third citation on our handout from a recent British novel. Another important thought, which I'll read aloud. History is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory meet the inadequacies of documentation. Isn't that a nice thought? Okay. Schweitzer's eschatology is our Polaris, but we sail upon rough waters on a moonless night. Temporal eschatology and the contingencies of evidence. I'll ask you to hold these 2 points in mind when I come to this evening's overarching topic, Christian identity, Paul's letters, and thinking with Jews. And those of you who watch reruns of Friends, I'm going to be doing this a lot around Jews. This topic rounds us back to the work that Reverend Hugo's Presbyterian congregation is doing in upstate Maine. She is leading her community through an exercise in historical thinking, but in so doing, she and they are engaged no less in a theological enterprise. These two activities are distinct and they are different, but they are conjoined. And precisely at this juncture of history and theology for Christian tradition sit Jews and Judaism. There are good reasons for this. Christianity, or perhaps more accurately, Christianities, emerged in antiquity from various kinds of Roman period Judaisms. The core of the Christian canon, Paul's undisputed letters and the four Gospels, are all types of Hellenistic Jewish writings. Further, texts specific to Jewish tradition, via Septuagint translations, were incorporated by the 4th century into the Christian canon as well. Christians today have a dual library of inherited revelation, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Thus, as soon as Christians read Christian scriptures, they encounter representations of Judaism and of Jews. It was in the course of the 2nd century that some forms of Gentile Christianity became quite specifically not Judaism. As these Christianities shaped and expressed their new identities, their new theological principles, and eventually, after Constantine, their new social policies, they used thinking with Jews to do so. Ideas about Jews and Judaism became essential to articulating the borders and the content of Christian communities and of the Christian self. More often than not, a negative construction of the former served to convey idealizations of the latter. Rhetorical Jews, Jews as a shorthand for misreadings of Scripture and for the wrong enactments of it, were hardwired into Christian discourses of all sorts. Traditions contra Judaios, or adversos Judaios, teachings against the Jews, came to serve as the drive wheel for ancient Christian thought. This unhappy story has been related many times, and I mentioned some core publications of this in item 4 of the handout. But thinking with Jews was not solely a negative enterprise. It was rather a flexible and fluid strategy. I discovered this by accident when working on Augustine. Augustine produced his early commentaries on Romans and on Galatians in the mid-390s, a few years prior to the Confessions. They attest to Augustine's uncertain professional standing in that decade. A former and successful Manichaean missionary in Carthage, he now had to interpret Paul against his former church. He thereby performed his new Catholic persona in front of a community of clerical colleagues suspicious of his past and resentful of his irregular and accelerated ascent up the ladder of North African church office. He basically went from being an adjunct professor to a chaired professor in a few months. He's very good politically. Not that people get resentful about that sort of thing. And never one to waste ammunition, Augustine also used Paul to take aim where he could at the rival church in North Africa, the Donatists. All of this work required the rhetorical equivalent of buckshot. Negative stereotypes of Jews and of Judaism provided the pellets. The best way to make Paul look like a 4th century North African Catholic was to construct a hostile antitype of Jews. Years later, I picked up Augustine's magnum opus against Latin Manichaeism, the Contra Faustum of 399. To my great surprise, there were chairs in the front if you want to commit. To my great surprise, I found exactly the opposite of what I expected to find. Once again, Augustine attacked Manichaean Christianity, but he never repudiated Judaism to do so. On the contrary, he defended Judaism, and he even praised it, while defending and praising as well the traditional practices of contemporary Jewish communities. In other words, it's thrilling when you discover this when you're doing research. Between 394 and 95, when he wrote his commentaries on Paul's letters, and 399-400, when he wrote the Contra Faustum, Augustine came to a view of Jews and of Judaism that differed dramatically, not only from his own prior teachings, but also from the prevailing teachings of his church. In an otherwise gloomy story of Christian anti-Judaism, Augustine provided a surprising shaft of light. I published Augustine and the Jews in 2008, the Yale edition in 2010. In 2011, Roman historian Brent Shaw brought out Sacred Violence. This is also on in the bibliography on item 4. This was an anguishing and detailed close-up of the brutal North African campaign against the dissident Donatists waged by the imperial church. And there, in Augustine's sermons, Shaw revealed the toxic swamp of anti-Jewish trash talk. Killers of Christ, vicious and mocking, ravenous roaring lions, vipers, asps, and scorpions, ravens feeding on death. Jews, said Augustine, were leagued with Satan, traitorous, perfidious, spurred by insane fury. The trash talk went on. And he's doing it in the equivalent of social media. He's saying it in sermons. Shaw repeatedly notes that Augustine's target was his Christian rivals. I'm quoting Shaw here now. The consistent message is that the Donatists are even worse than the Jews. The Donatists, of course, deployed exactly the same rhetorical Jews against the Catholics. The worst way to blacken your Gentile Christian rival was to call him a Jew. Here's the main idea for the next 3 lectures. Rhetorical Jews do Christian theological work. They serve to articulate theological points of principle for their Christian authors, both positively and negatively. In Roman antiquity, Augustine used Jews against Manichaees to defend the Catholic doctrines of creation, incarnation, and resurrection. Jews had long been associated with flesh, a negative category when compared with spirit. Against the Manichaees, however, who really didn't like flesh, Augustine rehabilitated flesh as a Christian theological category, and in so doing, he rehabilitated Jews. But against his other Christian opponents, the Donatists, he developed the dark themes of betrayal, inconstancy, vicious violence, accusations that he leveled at Donatists by identifying them with and as Jews. In other words, depending on the task at hand, Jews are either good or bad. A millennium later, Reformation politics drove rhetorical Jews into the heart of modern New Testament scholarship. Traditions adversus Judaeos by that point had a long history as a rhetorical stratagem for making Christian theological claims. But these were repurposed in the late Renaissance, when Reformed theologians weaponized, quote, justification by faith and not by works of the law, end of quote, against papal sacramentalism. Rhetorical Jews peopled the Reformers' invective. After all, They were the next worst thing to Catholics. Rhetoric impacts reality. Jews were more than a discursive trope in intra-Christian invective. They were also real people. In the 4th century, thanks to Constantine, one branch of the church became the well-muscled arm of a decaying imperial power. And as a result, rhetoric gained social traction. Historical Jews, as opposed to rhetorical Jews, real people, became the victims of real violence. Contesting Athanasian and Arian Christians, or Nestorian and Chalcedonian Christians, continued to accuse each other of being Jews, being like the Jews, or being worse than the Jews. But synagogues were actually seized, Jewish practices policed, Roman law altered, Jewish populations exiled or forcibly baptized. In the great bloodletting between Catholics and Protestants that convulsed Europe during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, Jews were caught in the intra-Christian crossfire. Christian anti-Judaism mid-20th century, a few years before I was born, undergirded by pseudoscientific racialist theory, propelled, encouraged, and excused the mass murder of millions of European Jews. And Americans, in the last few years alone, have once again seen how Jews are always a serviceable other, a usable target for muscular assertions of identity, ideas about citizenship, about religion, and about race. I'm not here to talk about Christian anti-Judaism. I want to look at current academic work on early Christianity, and most particularly on Paul. I want to illumine how the dynamics of history and theology, of identity and ethnicity, of sameness and difference, dynamics that so shaped the development of ancient Christianity, how these dynamics continue to shape New Testament scholarship today. In much recent work, I will argue, the Jews, whom New Testament scholars conceive and present as historical Jews, are actually still rhetorical Jews, a stratagem mobilized to frame modern Christian theological thoughts. So with that as my introduction, let's think about God for the rest of the lecture. Lamalo. When did Jesus become God? It was a gradual process, cresting in 325 at the Council of Nicaea. But claims for Jesus' divineness, divinity, his superhumanness, if you will, appear as soon as we have evidence for this late Second Temple Messianic movement, which is to say with Paul's letters. Our earliest Christology, theology about Christ, is already high Christology. Paul makes very high claims for Christ, and that's in number 5 from the primary documents on your handout. He designates him as a man from heaven, as somebody who pre-existed in spiritual form, pneumatic form, as God's agent in creation. Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, and thus the first of those who will be lifted and transformed. He is God's Son, the eschatological Lord and Davidic warrior who is about to return to defeat pagan gods and to effect that signature end-time miracle, the general resurrection of the dead. Once Christ reappears at the Temple Mount, the 12 tribes of Israel will reassemble, and together with the plenum of Gentile nations will praise Israel's God. Lower cosmic powers, newly subject to divine universal sovereignty, will, as a result of Christ's victorious return, praise God as well. After Christ's conquest of the cosmos, God will be all in all. Please remember, we're now in the 1st century, and it is a geocentric universe, not a solar universe. The Earth is in the center of the cosmos. That's quite a job description, in my view. But in terms of current scholarship on early high Christology, I am low church. For several decades now, some scholars have committed to Big Bang Christology, and the Big Bang is Jesus' resurrection. Some of the bibliography is listed in item 6. This event or experience, these scholars argue, prompted Jesus' earliest followers to associate him, even to identify him, this is their term, with the God of Israel, understanding Jesus in terms reserved previously for God the Father alone. This is just a staccato overview of a thickening bibliography. Some scholars urge this conviction was revealed in the earliest community's devotional practices. Christ followers called upon Jesus as Lord. By the way, in Roman antiquity, Lord is how you address any social superior, and I speak for Dean Sterling now when I suggest all of you refer to him as Kurios as well, because that would be the correct ancient Mediterranean thing to do. Okay, others insist, but I digress. Others insist that ancient Jews thought of their God as uniquely uncreated and everything else but God was created. This is a strict binary that allows for no intermediaries, so the raised Christ could not be such an intermediary. Therefore, on the basis of Jesus' resurrection, these scholars say, his followers understood that Jesus was, and I'm quoting one of them now, quote, contained within the unique identity of the one God. I don't know what that actually means. Or the early movement addressing Jesus as Kurios, and they're referring to biblical Yahweh texts, mean that they thought of Jesus as God. The Jewish Jesus movement's, quote, unwavering commitment to monotheism, coupled with its referral of uniquely divine attributes to Jesus, meant that Jesus, I'm reading one of these scholars, they realized that Jesus was the God of Israel's divine presence. Jesus shares in God's divine identity. In short, maintain these higher tier scholars, for this new messianic movement, Jesus was God. Paul in this reading really is a Christian theologian, and what he articulates is the theological novum, distinctly and even disruptively or transgressively different from other forms of, quote, monotheistic Jewishness. And this Christology originated well before Paul in Jerusalem, right after Jesus' execution. Nicaea and Chalcedon might be 3 or 4 centuries off over the historical horizon line, but according to the above reconstructions, these councils' points of principle were already understood, articulated, and proclaimed in Aramaic at Easter among Jesus' original strictly monotheistic Jewish followers. True, their amazing theological insight, namely that Jesus is God, was adequately, and I'm quoting here, appropriated only eventually, says one of these scholars, Richard Bauckham, appropriated only eventually by Martin Luther, Karl Barth, Jürgen Moltmann, and Richard Bauckham, page 59 of his book. The Catholics still didn't get the memo. Evidently, the earliest Christians were distinctly, if perhaps only incipiently, Protestant. Note the work that Jews do in these reconstructions. Jewish monotheism is a good thing. It provides Christ monotheism's necessary precondition. It is also a bulwark against the contagions of paganism. After all, this ball starts rolling not in the diaspora, but well before Paul, in Jerusalem, untouched by Hellenistic culture. Yet, at the same time, Jewish monotheism is a bad thing. In defense of their traditional strict monotheism, most Jews reject Christianity, some violently. Paul stands both at the giving and the receiving ends of this violence. Early, incredibly high Christology, I will argue, is generated not by ancient evidence, but by modern theological commitments to the Nicene formula. The Jews, conjured by this construct, are a formal and formative element of this Christology. They are rhetorical Jews. How do we gauge their relationship to historical Jews? I'm glad you asked. Let's start with the operative concept, monotheism. Monotheism is not a term of historical description, even for those ancient people whom we habitually identify as monotheists. In antiquity, the highest god, be it whatever his denomination, pagan, Christian, or Jewish, was a member of a larger class called gods. The very idea of a highest god, theos hypsistos, is intrinsically comparative. The god in question is the highest or biggest or best or strongest of all the other gods. Even the phrase that we find in inscriptions, one God in heaven, asserts superiority, but not singularity. The bibliography for this is in item 7 of your handout. An added complication is that Jewish scriptures teem with other gods, and you have a sample in item 8 of your handout. As is common in ancient literatures, and as is to be expected given antiquity's normal and normative association of peoples with pantheons, a point we'll return to tomorrow evening, gods struggle when their people struggle. Heaven's politics mirrored human politics. Therefore, when Israel battles Egypt, Israel's God battles the gods of the Egyptians. When Israel prevails over the Ammonites, Yahweh exiles their God. Their contesting relationship with Yahweh implies the autonomy and the moral independence of these other gods. After all, they resist him. In Jewish texts, of course, Yahweh always prevails, even when Israel does not. Outside of battle situations, the supremacy of Israel's God over these lesser gods is simply asserted. Yahweh presides over a divine court. In the midst of the gods, he gives judgment. He appoints these lesser beings to be the gods of Gentile nations in Deuteronomy 32. These other Elohim or Theoi all bow down to him. You have these texts in number 8. Israelite religious culture was aniconic. Many texts condemn the worship of the visual representations of these lower gods, that is, their cult statues or idols. But the reality, the power, and the active social agency of these other gods is simply assumed. Once Hebrew writings shift into Greek, some of these gods receive an upgrade. Moses counsels that they should not be reviled in Psalm 95:5. Also, these idols are no longer idols, but they are presented in Greek as daimonia, which means godlings, not demons. Demons seem trivial. Godlings, lesser gods, lesser meaning closer into the earth. Since these gods live in the diaspora Jews had to deal with them. Gods are resident of Roman and Greek cities. I include 2 Jewish inscriptions in number 8 as well, just talking about dealing with these gods who are literally in the neighborhood. Where did all these other gods come from? It's a nice question. Ancient Jewish texts display a certain narrative insouciance about divine origins. Some of these beings are named as God's sons, as Genesis 6. This hierarchical family language organizes their relationship. Sonship, especially in Mediterranean antiquity, implies derivation, dependence, and subordination. The unnamed divine assistants in Genesis 1:26, however, are just there, without framework or apology. Angelic origins likewise go unexplained, though angels abound in all sorts of ancient Jewish texts, with many powers and duties delegated to them. And that's some bibliography in number 9. God's absolute power over all these lesser beings is continuously asserted. His role as their maker, however, must be assumed or inferred, because, again, often in the narrative, they just show up. What then about God's status vis-a-vis all the other stuff other than God? Not just these other powers, but all of it. As with these lesser divine entities, so also with the larger material universe. We seem to be missing the backstory. In Genesis 1, God arranges what is already at hand: empty and formless earth, primeval cosmic waters. These primordial media, again without apology, are there. There is no idea of creation out of nothing, complicating the biblical stories, nor would there be until pagan philosophies developed the idea long after Paul's lifetime. Divine making in Genesis, and as we will see in a minute, in pagan philosophies, was fundamentally a form of organizing. Pre-existent stuff was whipped into shape, ordered and sorted, with the heavy lifting subcontracted to divine intermediaries. In the first century, there were a lot of them. Some of them were Jewish. Pagan philosophy in the early Roman period helped to order the opening chapter of Genesis, now available in Greek, into a form of rational cosmology. And in number 10, you'll see the terms that are used in Greek philosophy for this. In theistic philosophies that posit a high God, theos, God, and hule, matter, where all this stuff makes me think of what the surface of my desk looks like, are just there. They're two extreme poles of reality. Cosmos represents a precipitate that's organized, that kind of forms between them. You'll excuse me for using time language, because time is not a factor in the way this is imagined. Theos, God, expressed philosophy's criteria of perfection. The highest God was self-existing. That means he was contingent on nothing else for his own being. He or it was all good, good explained not ethically but metaphysically. He was all-powerful. He was changeless, which is an aspect of his perfection. He was without body, because body is a form of limitation. Therefore, he is beyond space and time. This God's notional opposite is the surface of my desk, hule, pre-existent, unformed matter. The organization of hule was tasked to divine powers, subordinate to the high God. It could be the highest God's demiurge, or his logos, or logoi, or depending on the myth, to his angeloi. Action and time do not really frame this idea of world-making, however. To preserve theos, God, from any imputation of change, philosophers also posited that hule and cosmos are co-eternal with God. They all exist co-eternally together. Christian theologians will eventually adapt these formulations to describe the interrelationship of persons in the Trinity. Philosophically educated readers of the Septuagint understood the biblical creation narrative in these terms. God's logos is Philo's second God, as similarly was the pre-incarnate Jesus for Justin Martyr. He calls him a heteros theos, another God, in the dialogue with Trypho. The highest God, this is the job description, the highest God doesn't move. His lieutenants eternally shaped order out of co-eternal matter, which was shadowy, vague, and formless. Only eventually did some thinkers come to fret over this idea. Did pre-existent matter imply some kind of limit on God? To what degree would it imply a principle independent of God? It was only in these intellectual circumstances in the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries that the counterintuitive idea of creation out of nothing itself comes to be. In the here and now, here and now being the Mediterranean in the 1st century, in the here and now, I don't know what was happening in New Haven then, the world was full of gods. Loyalty to or pious enthusiasm for one particular god, or the assertion of the superiority of one's own city's god, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, was not the same as asserting that the deity in question was the only God. For ancient monotheists, the heavens, although they were heavily populated, were organized by ranks with one God on top. At the pinnacle is this one highest God, but others range beneath. The physical universe expressed this theology. Fixed stars, then the planets and sun, then the moon, and then the earth in the middle. The organization, which is what cosmos means, the organized universe. And then daimonia, godlings, spirits, and special humans, as we'll see, heroes, emperors, and apostles. It's on the handout, so it must be true. All were divine. Godness, theos, in antiquity, was a fluid idea. Apollo, for example, was unquestionably one of the Olympian high gods. But with philosophy's development of the idea of a highest uncreated, uncontingent God, an intellectually sophisticated Apollo and good hexameters referred to himself and his Olympian colleagues as, this is a pagan inscription, as that god's angeloi, or messengers. The inscription is number 11 on your handout. Philo of Alexandria's 1st century heaven glowed with gods, those celestial bodies whom he names, quote, the manifest and visible theoi. It's in his commentary on Genesis, number 12. Justin, in the mid-2nd century, could comfortably identify Christ as, and I'm quoting him here, another God, as an angel, and as the Logos. For Clement of Alexandria, by contrast, gods and angels were two distinct and different species of superhuman beings. Both Celsus and Origen concurred that there are many different divine entities, angels, daimonia, gods, godlings, though Origen disputes that daimonia have a positive morality. As late as the 5th century, no less a light than Augustine conceded that the true difference between pagan gods and Christian demons really got down to terminology. This is City of God 923. Christians call gods demons, pagans call demons gods. Jews, pagans, and eventually Christians also all imputed divinity to special humans, and that you have some of this in 13 and 14 on your handout. Philo, at several points in his writings, designated Moses as Theos, God. In the 3rd century, Origen named both David and Paul as gods. They were without doubt not men, but gods, dei, in his commentary on Romans. And for pagans prior to 312, as well as for Christians thereafter, Roman emperors were divine. Up until Constantine, emperors received sacrificial cult. Thereafter, although the blood sacrifices were gone, divine prerogatives like priesthoods, liturgies, adoration of the imperial images, celebration of festal days, ritual prokinesis, body postures, incense, which is a marker of divine presence, and all publicly acknowledge the divine numen. In other words, there is a Christian cult of the emperor. Item 14. For all of these ancient persons and groups, in brief, sharp lines and clear boundaries between divinity and humanity were lacking. It's more like radio frequencies. Divinity traveled along a gradient between heaven and earth. An interesting and unusual opportunity for clarity, however, did present itself when the Romans, I love this, humans are just like themselves, when the Roman Senate in the 1st century BCE had to decide on a question of accounting. At issue was the tax status of a god. Ampharos, a lesser deity, already in one of your earlier inscriptions, he was a lesser deity closely associated with the healing god Asclepius, number 15 on your handout. The question before the Senate was, could lands attached to the temple dedicated to Ampharos' cult be taxed? The Senate ruled yes, reasoning that Ampharos, since he had begun life as a human before becoming a god, did not fall into the category of immortal gods. He only became immortal. As now, evidently, so then, the higher the status, the fewer the taxes. Well, God is a pretty big topic. I'm going to sum up. We have ranged over heaven and earth. We've ranged across biblical traditions in Hebrew and in Greek. We've touched upon philosophical cosmogonies, and we have surveyed a wide range of beings, human and superhuman, whom ancients designated as gods. In the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods, biblical myth transmuted by Greek language became available to philosophical rationalization. Philosophy could organize the narratives available in Hebrew scriptures. But the Greeks were not the ones who introduced many gods into biblical stories. Celestial intermediaries and lower divine beings were there. In other words, God was never the only God, not even in his own book. Other gods in Jewish writings were always there. The problem with the interpretive notion of quote-unquote pure Jewish monotheism, such as my colleagues who are early, incredibly high Christology people cite, the problem with the idea is that it never existed. Early, very high Christology requires its existence, however. This construction firewalls very high Christology against any complicating concept of divine multiplicity, thereby enabling, as a claim about the early 1st century, the identification of the post-resurrected Jesus with the God of Israel. But no one in antiquity, neither Jew nor Greek, as I hope I have persuaded you, believed in the existence of only one God. That idea of monotheism had not yet been born. Nor was there a sharp binary between God and everything else, a P, not P distinction cosmically. The strictly monotheist Jews required of early very high Christology, in short, are rhetorical Jews doing Christian theological work. They are not historical Jews. But this Christological construct fails historically for a second reason, namely, it renders the next 3 to 4 centuries of Christian theological developments all but incomprehensible. And I cite Professor Adela Collins in 16 of our handout. How could generations of theologians have so consistently and universally failed to see that Paul had already claimed that Jesus is God? Why indeed did the Arian controversy erupt at all? If the radical identification of Jesus with God had already debuted on a Sunday in the year 30, somewhere in Jerusalem, probably in April. Why, if the resurrection provided early incredibly high Christology with this big bang, do we have this big lag? And lastly, we have one more awkward complication. Paul himself acknowledges the existence of many other gods and lords, and that's the final item, 17, on your handout. These beings are active and independent social agents. They seek to frustrate Paul's mission. The God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers, 2 Corinthians 4:4. At the end, these pagan gods will staff Christ's cosmic resistance. Christ will triumph, Paul asserts, but the question is, triumph over what? Over precisely these lower gods, lords, and cosmic forces. All those superhuman knees, quote, above the earth and upon the earth and below the earth in Philippians 2, will bend in submission. No hostile cosmic forces can or will prevail against God's returning eschatological warrior. That's the job description of a Messiah. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Messiahs have Davidic lineage and they're warriors. Paul's ideas about Jesus' Davidic identity, in other words, Paul's vision of final redemption, Paul's convictions about the establishment of God's kingdom, all of these absolutely required the real existence and active independent agency of lower pagan gods. That this was so, we have in Paul's own letters, and you have in item 17 of the handout. But why was this so? Come back tomorrow evening and I'll tell you. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Professor Fredriksen. So the floor is open to questions. We have a mic. If you would, I'll call on you. Would you please identify yourself briefly and then pose your question succinctly? Disguise your comment as a question. So the floor is open. So I'll ask the question just to break the ice here.
Thank you.
So when you think of monotheism, or creatio ex nihilo, so this is about that. One of the views is that it actually comes out of a response to Gnosticism, starting in the beginning 2nd century and beyond. So you talked about out of the philosophical tradition, and this is a footnote in your topic, but I'm wondering if you would respond to that. Still post 1st century.
Yes.
Yes, it's still 2nd century CE that we're talking about, or later.
Yes.
Before you had this, and it's not in Jewish sources.
I think it's an issue. Theology depends on philosophy the way physics depends on mathematics. And I think that you have to have developments within philosophy before theological problems can even dawn, much less be articulated. Valentinus, if you read, has some of you read, have any of you read Ptolemy's letter to Flora? Okay, that's a very sophisticated, philosophically inflected vision of God. He's a Christian Gnostic, but he's got a PhD in Middle Platonism. So he's thinking with philosophy. And obviously this is something that Plotinus is worried about too. So these are philosophical issues. I think you can, there's a problem of how nothing is nothing. Let me let me clarify that. Is nothing absolutely nothing, or is it sort of something? And there's a question, Henry Chadwick raised this issue with the making something ek me ontos, which is, me is the subjunctive form of negation, or ek uk ontos, which is the indicative form. So is it absolute nothing or nothingness relative to something? And it takes somebody of the brilliance and intellectual flexibility of Origen of Alexandria to square the difference. Has any of you read our Origins on First Principles? This is, yay. It really is one of my favorite books. I don't get out much. Origen makes the argument that there is a pre-cosmic world of eternally existing, pre-existent souls, which have spiritual bodies, and body is the principle of individuation, and the rational being has a spiritual body. And there's God, which is the only asomaton, the only non-embodied thing. And then, because things slide away, God, as a gracious, providential, and loving act, calls matter into existence out of nothing as a medium for redemption so that the fallen souls can work their way back up. Even Origen, who, and he says, not in English, he says, it's so obvious that matter is created out of nothing that I'm puzzled that so many intelligent and well-educated men before this point have, which is late second, early third century, have thought that matter comes from relatively nothing. And but even for Origen, he had to have a pre-cosmic cosmos. It's still not, matter might come from nothing, but cosmos is eternally pre-existing anyway. So even Origen couldn't quite get there. I'm glad we clarified that. Yes?
Thank you, Paula. Really interesting presentation on a really complex set of issues. And I thoroughly agree with you that the really early high Christology folk are pushing things anachronistically. But I'm wondering a little bit about Philo. You have one little section here on Philo, and I suspect Greg might have something to say about this too. And in Philo, you do have the second God. The Logos is the second God, Deuteros Theos. But you also have a kind of emerging notion of the transcendence of the first principle, don't you? That you don't have creation ex nihilo yet, but you have a notion of transcendence based on Platonic philosophical principles. You're right on that too. The Platonic philosophy is important here. Mm-hmm. And doesn't that push things toward a certain kind of monotheism, philosophically informed Jewish monotheism that's a little different from what you get in inscriptions in the Bosporus?
Do you want to answer this question too? Yes. But people are emotionally very attached to it's almost like the word monotheism is a slogan. I mean, it's what makes us in the West different from them, which is these messy people not in the West. But if Philo is calling Moses a god, and if he's calling the Logos a god, and if he's calling God, then that's not monotheism. And there's a book by Benjamin Summer called The Body of God. Is that the right? Where he has an appendix specifically on the problems with using the word, and he says, face it, the common sense definition of monotheism is that there's only one God, and that's not an ancient idea of monotheism, but monotheism is, and this is what I said, ancient monotheism is one God on top. God, the highest God, is special. That's the job. But I wouldn't say, why keep using this word? It's an invention of the 17th century for good reason.
Yeah. Just one little comment, and it'd be interesting to have this as a seminar discussion, because you're right that Philo calls Moses God, but he does so because Scripture does.
Yeah, right.
And for him, it's a problem that he has to solve and has to resolve because it raises philosophical issues. And so the fact that there are those issues suggests that there's something.
How about calling
verging
the
on.
stars and planets theoi?
Yeah, you can use things metaphorically too. And he does that because Aristotle does. So he has a philosophical precedent for using divine language for natural phenomena. But for him, this would be using things in a secondary or allegorical sense.
You're saying he doesn't really mean it.
That's right. And he has a theory about how language works that allows him to do that.
I'm just a historian. I can't read his mind. I'm just reading his text.
Laura, some of us can discuss this over dinner.
Or we can just stay here and argue about it the rest of the night.
I want to thank you.
I feel like you should
Yes.
call her Kuria also and just do the whole thing, right?
Kill it,
Incense,
Maya.
right?
Is it okay? Thank you for such a great talk. It's hard to come up with questions because I find it largely convincing. I wanted to ask you to refine, to talk more, if you would like, about. So there's, you cite the current debate kind of among those who are more interested in so-called pagan literature on henotheism, megatheism, pagan monotheism. You have argued yourself earlier that we should think about local gods and the God of Israel as a local God that is itself transportable to other regions. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that issue of the local God, and then in terms of Paul's letters, to talk about the issue of the Kyrios within, of divine possession at all, or maybe I'm presaging what you're going to do in the next evenings.
In fact, I am availing myself of the Libanius tomorrow, the text that you shared with me. Ancient gods are local in two senses. I'm talking gods, not philosophy is a very special subpopulation of intellectuals in antiquity. I'm talking about gods here instead. Gods tend to attach to people and to places. And there's a wonderful book it was just the Sather Lectures, Greek Gods Abroad. Do you know that book? By Parker, about divine diasporas. Gods traveling, because gods are located with people. If you talk to classicists, as I do, they're not... They think of the God of Israel as an ethnic God. What's the big deal if he's the God of Israel? He may be claiming that he's the God of everybody, but other people who aren't part of Israel tend not to know that. And one of the big repair that eschatology does is they'll know it at the end. But there's an ethnic identification with ancient gods that's normal for ancient gods. Philosophy is a meta discourse. And what's amazing about the development of Christian theology is the way it actually goes back to a problem that Plato talks about with poets, right? It's the problem of making philosophical sense of narrative. And that's where you get the gear grinding and the confusions of, this God in this narrative is fighting other gods, but actually, when you read about it, he's got to be a transcendent God, and then that flips over to a meta discourse on the narrative. So that's a response. It's not really an answer, but this is really the radioactive core of what creates classical Christian theology is exactly this, I think, tension with philosophy and biblical narrative.